We are all victims of the algorithm.
Blessings on the hand of women, angels guard its strength and grace. In the palace, cottage, hovel, oh, no matter where the place. Would that never storms assailed it, rainbows ever gently curled. For the hand that rots the cradle is the hand that rules the world. That stanza comes from a poem written by American poet William Ross Wallace back in 1865, and it praises motherhood as this powerful guiding force in shaping society. And it is true, women play a integral part in structuring and shaping society in a positive manner. The problem, though, is we don't live in a matriarchal society. Since the inception of Abrahamic religions across the world, the patriarchy has ruled, thanks to the Abrahamic religions. With us now being in this age of information, though, a lot of the younger generations are starting to break free from the matrix and they're starting to march to the beat of their own drum. But there are people in power who believe in the old gods, if you will, and they want to keep the old rule in place. And I think that's part of the reason why you see people in power love to find spokespersons from marginalized groups to help push these agendas. It's a manipulation strategy that is actually documented and named the weaponized horizontal hostility. And this is basically when marginalized or oppressed people direct anger, judgment, and bullying at their own peers instead of fighting the systemic power structures causing their oppression. We continue to fight amongst one another while those up top to continue to consolidate power. And we have seen one of their latest spokespersons in Sophie Cunningham for the Indiana Fever. Now, I am well aware of Sophie Cunningham because she was drafted by and played for the Phoenix Mercury for quite some time. And I was someone who I was a big fan of Sophie Cunningham. She, brought energy off the bench, and she was, kind of a role player who, brought some pizzazz to the game. And she was entertaining. And then out here in Phoenix, when Natasha Cloud came to the Phoenix Mercury and became our point guard, her and Sophie were like super good friends, and they would take photos together and they would do all types of photo shoots together and everything. And then all of a sudden, you start to not see the two of them around each other. And then Natasha famously went on to social media and basically kind of said something to the extent of not being able to be friends with people who vote in a way that could demonize and harm you. And a lot of people kind of read between the lines that the Cloud had figured out that Sophia Cunningham was a Trump supporter, and that's where that rift came. And then from there, some other stuff happened between Sophia Cunningham and the owner or whatever at the time. I won't dive in all of that, but Sophie ended up getting traded. She ended up playing for the Indiana Fever with the right great white hope of Caitlin Clark. And I think that Sophia Cunningham saw this as an opportunity to fully dive into that MAGA Barbie persona and kind of pave the way for the next step in her career once her WNBA career is over. Now, we recently saw a lot of this come to a head, and it started in essentially July when Sophie Cunningham's attack on the trans community kind of went public with an interview that she had did with ESPN. And apparently she had did that interview with ESPN back in March, and either it didn't make headways back then, or July 21st leading into the WNBA All-Star game, the interview was released and a lot of attention came of it because there was so much attention at the time around the WNBA. And basically in the interview, she was getting interviewed and they were asking her about the public's opinion on her. And when asked about the MAGA Barbie persona, she said that it was a projection because she said, "I am very much in the middle. I agree with things on both sides, disagree with things on both sides, and that's all I ever said about my political beliefs, but people love to assume." Now, I mentioned that earlier about Stephen A. Joe Rogan, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg. There's a lot of people like this who very much so have a lot of conservative and right-wing beliefs, but this is the new thing of, no, I'm a moderate, I'm in the middle. It just so happens that the right is correct, but politically I'm in the middle. Now, she continued in that interview, and she continued to call the way people were acting towards her a projection because of the way she looks and where she's from. She then continued to weigh in and say that she protects women's sports, and she believes that she's qualified to speak on this, being a women athlete. And she said, I get a lot of negative feedback about me hating trans, and I'm like, I never once said that. I think that I'm here to extend love, but I also think with that love is truth, being honest. And I want to protect young girls in a locker room or young girls in sports who shouldn't have to go against biological men. Now, that started to, make its way on social media, and she got asked about it the next day before the Indiana Fever played the Connecticut Sun. And she doubled down and she said, I think it's kind of common sense. And I think I'll always believe in that. I think it's really important to protect children, and that's little girls who are also involved in that category. I stand on what I said. Now, again, this conversation continued to bubble, continued to get bigger, and Sophie Cunningham has a podcast with a longtime friend of hers by the name of Wes Wilson. And Wes Wilson was asked about his co-host comments, and he disagreed with her, and he said right-wingers have convinced a massive portion of people in our country that transgender athletes are a threat to sports in America, when mathematically that's not the case at all. He continued and said, so I think there are unique questions that could be handled on individual basis, but to allow this to take our attention away from housing and healthcare and wars and all the other actual harm in our country is dumb. Now, considering that there is a large side of the right side of politics, their fan base, listening to that podcast and following Sophie, a lot of people disagreed with him. And so the conversation just continued to bubble and kind of hit a new fever pitch during July 28th. There was a game where the Indiana Fever headed out to the Climate Pledge Arena to take on the Seattle Storm. And ahead of the game, a crowd of a few dozen gathered to support Sophie Cunningham, and also to do a protest against a statewide, or to promote, a statewide ballot initiative, IL 26-638, which would bar transgender students from participating in girls' athletics at Washington schools. Now, some members of the group carried signs in support of Cunningham and wore t-shirts that had the XX and XY chromosomes. That's one of the right-wing logos. That's one of their t-shirt brands that are out there that a lot of people who claim to care about women's sports, they'll, rock one of those shirts. And those fans even made it inside of the arena, as there was two teenage girls who somehow got courtside seats, and they were in the front row with their signs. And one of the signs said, "Thank you, Sophie, for speaking up for girls." Now, that made headwaves because, again, they're in the front row, and so there was no avoiding it. And there was quite a few pictures of like the Seattle Storm coach standing, observing the game, and you can see the girls in the background. There was another time when Caitlin had got knocked down to the ground, and she's kind of sitting on the ground getting ready to get up, and you can see the girls in the background, and it was very prominent and right there for everyone to see on the camera. And quite frankly, I think it was a bit of a staged event to put these two specific teenage girls right there in the front for all of the cameras to see. Now, that situation ended up getting even more headway, because at some point during the night, I believe it was before the game, but it could have been during the game. I haven't been able to get exactly when this happened because I didn't see any footage of it. But one of the minority owners for the Seattle Storm, Celeste Keaton, apparently confronted the girls, and the WNBA fined her and then suspended her from her team's next 5 home games. And of course, Sophie Cunningham took that as another opportunity to kind of get her name out there in the interwebs, and she publicly criticized the co-owner's behavior, and she expressed support for the young fans, to which those fans enjoyed that attention, and they continue to talk about doing more and more of these protests outside of WNBA games. Now, fast forward to August 2nd, and the Indiana Fever head out to the Target Center to take on the Minnesota Lynx. The night before the game, Cheryl Reeve, the coach of the Minnesota Lynx, was interviewed, and this transgender athlete conversation came up. And Cheryl said, it is not the case that we have, quote unquote, biological men in girls' locker rooms. She said the way it's been phrased, the innuendo there, that somehow transgender women are predators of some kind in the locker room, that's a lot of narrative that is problematic that we need to address. That is simply not what is happening. And going into the game, Cheryl Reeve kind of doubled down on this stance and standing up for the transgender community by wearing a shirt that says "Trans Kids Belong." Now, before the game, you could see at some point Cheryl Reeve and Sophie Cunningham were at midcourt engaged with one another. And while they didn't share exactly what they talked about during this conversation mid-court before the game started, Cheryl Reeve did tell reporters after the game, both of us understand that we have platforms, and we both talked about wanting to, more than anything, educate. She wouldn't further disclose what exactly they talked about, but she said there are some things that we have in common and maybe some things you differ on, just like any issues. I think it's how you handle things. It was nice to be in person for sure. So Cheryl, continues to be a class act, and I agree with that. I've said that quite often. That is a problem with where we are in today's society. Yes, there's a lot of racism, and there's a lot of bigotry, and there's a lot of homophobia, and there's a lot of that going on in today's society, and that is a problem. But I think one of the bigger problems is we are talking at each other. Well, a lot of times we're taking these headlines, and then we're having these emotional reactions, and we keep fighting and keep butting heads with one another. And again, as I said at the top of the segment, I believe that there's a group behind the scenes who is well aware of these distractions and these arguments and rallying us up, and they're allowing it to continue for a reason. Now, this political theater continued, and one of the right's favorite athletic grifters, Riley Gaines, came to a game to support Sophie Cunningham, and they took a picture before the game. And Riley Gaines just so happened to have one of the XXXY t-shirts on. Now, those who don't know the history of Riley Gaines became famous in March of 2022 when her and transgender woman Leah Thomas both tied for 5th place in the 200-yard freestyle event at the NCAA's Women's Swimming Championships. And basically, since then, Riley Gaines has made it her living to protect young girls from trans women in their sports. Now, shouts out to Pablo Torre, who is an investigative reporter. He's the one that's been involved in that whole situation with the whole Clippers, Kawhi Leonard under the table money deal through that shady landscaping company and all that. He's the one that kind of blew that story up. Before all of that, he did a whole investigative journalist piece on Riley Gaines, and he was the one who proved that she is indeed a grifter when it comes to this whole situation. On his show, he highlighted that Riley is financially backed by a ton of conservative donors. There is conservative donors who are putting money behind her to help get her name out there in some of these, public appearances and all that. And one of the hypocrisy that he kind of called out with Riley Gaines in her protecting women is that she is close friends with former University of Kentucky head coach Lars Jorgensen, and he has faced major sexual abuse allegations and has so many allegations against him and so much evidence against him, you know, using his position of power in an incorrect manner with these, you know, young girls who went to the University of Kentucky to try to, you know, join the, you know, swim team and all that. He has been banned from coaching. And since then, Riley Gaines is, by all accounts, still friends with this guy. And even recently in one of her memoirs, she was still bigging the guy up even after all these allegations. And so that's one of the things that kind of begs the question. You claim that your goal is to use your celebrity to protect girls in sports, and one of the biggest things that unfortunately happens to young girls in sports is them being victimized by male coaches. But you never see Riley Gaines talk about anything with male coaches. Hell, even in the WNBA right now, there is way more male coaches than there are women coaches in the WNBA, and that is something that should have attention brought to it. You know, even when it comes to, you know, there have been polls with young, you know, female athletes, and one of the number one indicators that kind of shows that women won't pursue athletics, you know, much further outside of, you know, youth stuff. They typically, you know, kind of stray away from it, is the fact that they don't have enough women coaches and women mentors to kind of make them feel safe and protected to go follow, you know, the path of women's sports. And again, Riley Gaines, with all of her celebrity and her ties with fucking the Trump administration, if you're really trying to protect women's sports, I think that, for one, you shouldn't be friends with a alleged sexual abuser. And you could be using this opportunity to try to highlight how we need more women in positions of power within women's sports. But you don't. You use the fact that you tied for fifth with a transgender woman, and you want transgender women out of sports. And if Leah Thomas wasn't allowed to compete in that sport, Riley Gaines, you still would have came in fifth place. Nothing about your standing changed with or without that transgender woman in that event. And again, it's always how they position it. You know, they always position, oh, Riley, you know, had this opportunity taken away from her from a trans athlete. And they always position it in a way like that trans athlete won. But no, that trans athlete didn't even medal in that competition. But again, like I said, we live in a society today where the focus is more so on the headlines and us having these major discussions based off of headlines and not what is actually in the meat and potatoes of the story. Now, furthermore, Riley Gaines continued to show that she's a grifter as she went on social media after the game to talk about, you know, support about the WNBA. And she talked about how it was so cool to watch Rhyne Howard play for the Lynx because they went to the University of Kentucky together. But the problem is Rhyne Howard is a black woman that plays for the Atlanta Dream. And the black woman whose last name is Howard that plays for the Minnesota Lynx is Natasha Howard. So it wasn't even the same Howard. Riley Gaines saw a black woman playing basketball with the last name Howard and assumed that was the black woman she went to school with. Again, this is who these people are. Now, these protests have not stopped as there has been petitions and stuff online of more and more Sophie Cunningham supporters wanting to go to more and more of these WNBA games to protest against trans women competing in sports. And this has turned into such a big story that now this is also starting to impact star player Caitlin Clark, as the right is starting to get pissed off at Caitlin Clark and how she's not kind of doubling down on the bigotry with Sophie Cunningham. Now, during a post game a couple days ago, Caitlin Clark was specifically asked about protecting women's sports. And you could see in Caitlin's face that she's kind of, you know, a tad frustrated. And she says it's for the leagues and governing bodies to work with their athletes to find solutions. Caitlin continued to say that she just wants to focus on basketball. And this is consistent with her take on a bunch of things, because as I said on the last podcast, she's been asked a bunch of times about white supremacists using her, you know, face and her likeness when it comes to, racism. And she has been very vocal about she is not here to, be an advocate or a social justice person. Like, she's here to play basketball. That's all she wants to do is play basketball. And as us within the African American community has called out to her that is not enough, and people on the right has been like, oh, shut the fuck up, she's just here to play basketball, you can't make her talk about these things. Here they are now with this whole transgender thing, and she won't speak on this, and the right is starting to get pissed. Matt Welsh, who's a famous right-wing commentator, went as far as to tweet, Caitlin Clark might be the biggest coward in the history of sports. She refuses to say anything about the anti-white racism she has been subjected to since coming into the league, and she punts on the trans question, which is the easiest question you could ever be asked. No spine. And yeah, you could go through social media, and there are a ton of right-wing people who have been very vocal about Caitlin Clark being the victim of racism in the WNBA, who have been supporting her from a racial lens, if you will, who they have also been, backing up Sophie Cunningham as she has said all this anti-trans stuff, and they keep saying this is the easiest thing that you can answer, and they're pissed that Caitlin is still riding that middle line of not wanting to piss anybody off, and now they are upset. Now, I'm not surprised that after Caitlin got asked about this, then a day or so later, Sophie then kind of came out during one of the times when, you have the media come down to the arena as everyone's working out and practicing, and Sophie said, I'm going to let people just do the speaking for themselves, but for me, I want to get back to basketball. It's always been about basketball. That interview happened back in March. I just want to make sure that the focus stays where it should be, because people are playing at such a high level. That is correct, because as I just mentioned in the last segment, the WNBA All-Star Game had more attendees there than the men's All-Star Game earlier in the year, and the WNBA is playing at an all-time level. You got Olivia Miles, who's absolutely killing it. She's reminding people of Magic Johnson, how Magic Johnson, his rookie year, he came in and he dominated everything. It was the MVP. And hell, to not even take away from the women, let's stick with the WNBA. You had Candace Parker, who came in her rookie year and took the world by storm and was the MVP. And Olivia Miles is looking like one of the best women's basketball player in the world in her rookie season. And you got, the ratings are through the roofs, and you have all this great stuff going on. But it's very difficult to talk about the WNBA game because of all this toxic bullshit going on with all these white supremacists and grifters who are getting involved in the WNBA game, who don't care about women's sports at all. They gain attention by, for one, being at Riley Gaines and talking about this stuff and, getting paid to, bring up these things that are not actual issues really affecting America, but you make money off of it because conservatism is content that is super valuable today. And you have these people on Twitter. Twitter has that whole verified program where you get paid off of engagement, and it's very easy to say bigoted, racist shit on Twitter and get other racist, bigoted people to join in and agree with you, or get people who are not bigoted to unfortunately get roped up into it and start arguing with these people, and then the engagement goes through the roof and these people get absolutely paid. And again, like I've said, plenty of time, as talking about the whole Caitlin Clark situation, I have made mention of, I have talked basketball on social media, and actually recently get away from Caitlin and switch over to Sophie Cunningham. Recently there was a ESPN interview where they had interviewed Sophie Cunningham, and they had said something like, oh, Sophie Cunningham comes off the bench and scores 11 points, and this is, that's who we're interviewing today. And it was just a weird headline, because me being someone who has watched basketball my whole life, I couldn't ever remember a time in the NBA when someone was like, oh my God, this guy scored 11 points off the bench, let's interview him. Like, it was just a weird headline for them to make. And I said something about it, and boy, oh boy, did all the racists hop in my mentions and call me low IQ and a monkey and a nigger boy and just all this stuff. You cannot talk about women's basketball, and you specifically can't say anything about Sophie Cunningham or Caitlin Clark in a negative manner without you being attacked. But as I said, Caitlin Clark is starting to get attacked by that fan base because, again, that fan base doesn't stand for anything but bigotry. And they have been wanting Caitlin to be the face of their bigotry, but she will not get involved in that. But now that it's this trans debate and she is still riding that middle line, that side of the fan base is starting to turn their back on her, and they're starting to align themselves with Sophie. And I believe that the Fever or somebody in the PR team finally was like, hey, Sophie, we need you to try to, put this fire out. But again, it's kind of a tad too late because, you can't throw rocks and then hide your hand. This is a situation that Sophie brought upon herself. Now, it's one thing if, she made that comment, because again, I'm not in America. You have the right to free speech. All of us have the right to our opinions. I'm not saying that people who opinion differs than me, that they should be silenced. That's not what I'm saying at all. If you disagree with the things that I am saying, make your own podcast, make your own content channels, and you speak your truth. That's what all of this is about. We have access to the internet. We have access to these tools to, be content creators, and I live in my truth. You live in your truth. I'm not saying that anyone should be silenced, but I am saying that Sophie, made the comments that she made, and she continued to double down on it. And she continued to say it's common sense, and she continued to talk about it every chance that she got. And then, even like I said, in that situation where the Seattle Storm owner had got suspended, Sophie could have shut the fuck up. But no, she said something. She doubled down and got in it. She wants the attention. But it wasn't until things started, looking negative for the team is when she then was like, hey, can we just focus on basketball? And no, because you have not been focusing on basketball. You've been focusing on everything else. Like, unfortunately, Sophie Cunningham at this point in her career is not known for a single basketball thing. Everything about Sophie Cunningham is unfortunately negative attention. Like I said, the situation between her and Natasha Cloud, the situation with her and the fucking owner having an affair, her attention around this MAGA shit and this transgender stuff. Like, no, we never talk about Sophie Cunningham because of anything basketball related. And it's a damn shame because she can be hot at times. She's had 30-point games. I could be off on that, but I know she's at least scored 20 points in various games, even going back to her days with the Mercury. But again, her career averages over the course of her career is 9 points, 2 rebounds, and 1 assist per game. Sophie Cunningham, by all cases, is the Patrick Beverley of the WNBA. But Patrick Beverley is not this famous. Patrick Beverley has never been asked to be a ring girl at the UFC. And Patrick Beverley, wasn't getting all these interviews with ESPN and all these different places when, he was actually in the league. It wasn't until he started podcasting that then he started to, quote unquote, get more famous. And then unfortunately, he had the whole situation where he choked his little sister or whatever. And so his career has taken a dive, if you will. But again, Sophie Cunningham is the WNBA's version of Patrick Beverley, but she is this quote-unquote superstar, and all of this is because of the MAGA Barbie stuff, and she's gotten famous off of that. She even recently, if I'm not mistaken, has shoes coming out, if I'm not mistaken. I'm Googling this in real time. Yes, Adidas. The Crazy Energy Sophie Cunningham basketball shoes are designed for athletes and performance-driven players. And yeah, they're out of stock right now, but they retail for $120. And then it is absolutely hilarious. And quite frankly, I think somebody at Adidas did a silent protest, because if you see the shoes are this gradient pink, white, and blue, which is the color of the trans flag. So I genuinely think that was a silent protest. Somebody at Adidas was like, why the fuck are we giving her a shoe? And they did a silent protest by using the trans pride flag colors in her colorway for her shoes. But yeah, I digress. But either way it goes, when it comes to Sophie Cunningham, she's not stupid. She's doing the same thing that Enes Kanter did. Enes Kanter was a guy who was a role player in the NBA, who we never talked about any highlights from his actual basketball career. Enes Kanter became famous, towards the end of his NBA career because of his beef with LeBron James. And Enes Kanter would go on Fox News and do all these things about LeBron and how he's paid for by the Chinese Communist movement and this, that, and the third. And that is what Enes Kanter ended up turning the second half of his career was, being a right-wing political machine. And this is exactly what the fuck Sophie Cunningham is doing. Because quite frankly, to be honest, I would be very surprised if after this season, I don't know what her contract is, but when this Indiana Fever contract is over, I find it very difficult to believe that another WNBA team is going to pick her up because of the distraction that her name is. It just brings too much bad stuff to it. And quite frankly, I would not be surprised if the Indiana Fever move away from her after the season is over, because actually shouts out to Bomani Jones, who just had an episode of The Right Time with Bomani Jones. He had, what's her name, Elle Duncan come on the show, and they talked about this Sophie Cunningham situation also. And Bomani Jones had a real good point saying how you could have the rule in sports is you can have one knucklehead on your team, but you can't have two or more knuckleheads on your team. Meaning that if you want the attention to be on your team and the performance that they're doing, yes, you could have one knucklehead who's a distraction. And in the sense of the Indiana Fever, that knucklehead, if you will, was Caitlin Clark. But Caitlin Clark is also a great basketball talent, so you can put up with the nonsense off court because of, the attendance and the merchandise and all of that comes with her. But now, on top of Caitlin Clark, you also have Sophie Cunningham, who's also bringing some other negative attention, but she's also not producing at that rate on the court. So do you really want two knuckleheads on your team? Chances are no. So I would not be surprised if this is the last year that Sophie Cunningham is on the Indiana Fever. But regardless, I think once her time with the Indiana Fever is done, I think she's done as a WNBA player. And I believe she's aware of that. And that's the reason why she's starting to position herself in the way that she is to move on to this next stage of her career. Now, when it comes to this whole trans debate too, one of the other things that just came up recently was there was video of a French trans woman who's dominating the league out in France, and these highlights, and that was the first time I saw it, was the highlights of her spinning in the paint and making layups and getting rebounds. And it's a 6'3" trans woman, so she's bigger than the rest of the players on the court, and they're showing her, dominating at the rim. But again, as I always say, we focus too much on headlines, we focus too much on clips, and a lot of people don't do deep dives. Even the 520 Club podcast with Jeff Teague, they fell for it too, as they were showing the highlights and talking about how, she would dominate in the WNBA. And we know for a fact that this is more than likely incorrect, because once you dig a little deeper than the clip and dig a little deeper than the headline, you'll see that Julia Tétart is a 34-year-old French trans woman who plays out in France, but she doesn't play in the major league out in France. She plays in their second tier league, Ligue 2, which is basically their G League out there in France. And so, yes, she is dominating, but she's dominating in their G League. So if this French trans woman is not good enough to make it to the major league out in France, why in the world would you think that she would dominate in the WNBA, where we have the greatest women's basketball players from around the world? And again, the headline also is disingenuous, because I've even saw Fox News pick it up, and the way that a bunch of these news outlets are framing it is trans athlete says she would not turn down an offer from the WNBA, and they're positioning it like the WNBA is actively recruiting this woman, and that's not the case. If you actually read the actual interview, they talk to her about her time out there, and this is that fucking out Kick or whatever media outlet, who is another one of those who, is right leaning, and they're pushing all these stories for the right because, again, there's a lot of money in this. And unfortunately, this woman out in France kind of, fell for this. She wasn't aware of how they were trying to use her, and she's just excited because she's, getting interviewed. But they were interviewing her, and they were talking about, hey, if the WNBA were to give you a call, would you play? And she was like, yeah, of course I wouldn't turn that down. But then she also said, I am 34 and at the end of my career, so those days of trying to go pro, is probably long behind me. But again, they don't talk about that. They just talk about the headline. And since there's all this fear about trans women taking over women's sports, this is the perfect time for them to go find a French athlete and say, oh, look how she's dominating. But again, she's not. She's dominating the fucking minor league out there in France. And again, people, stop falling for this okie doke. Y'all keep falling for these headlines and these clips, and we need to be a little smarter, and we need to dig a little deeper. But yeah, when it comes down to the come down, should trans athletes compete in sports with cis athletes? And I don't have the answer for that, and I would never sit here and try to act like I have the answers to that. There's been quite a bunch of studies. There was a study recently, this Brazilian group put together this study and basically kind of showed that transgender women, after 1 to 2 years of hormone therapy, they are not competing at the level of cis men. They're competing closer to the level of cis women. So there has been, science to that, of that, the hormones, it does change the body, and they're not as strong as if they weren't on those hormones. And then same thing on the flip side of it, you have, because this trans debate, we're always talking about trans women. There are also trans men, people who are assigned female at birth who then transition to men. And those who go the, full distance with taking the hormone therapy, they introduce testosterone, and then they are able to then weight lift, and they're stronger than cis women because they're on testosterone. Like, a lot of this comes down to testosterone. But again, I say all that to say that the science is what needs to dictate all of this, and these are not a lot of science people who are having these conversations. These are grifters who know that I could say this hot button thing and I know it's going to get clicks, and they're abusing this, and they're abusing a marginalized group, because again, trans people make up less than 1% of the population. But meanwhile, you have people in positions of power who are passing laws like transgender people left and right are competing in sports, and that is just not the fucking case. This is another example of people in power being able to continue to stay in power by continuing to get us distracted with fighting with black versus white and gay versus straight, or gay versus bisexual, or cis versus trans, while they continue to be on top and consolidate power. Because again, it's way more of us than it is of them, but they have consolidated their power, and they have all of us fighting one another in these marginalized groups, and that is how they keep winning, even though it's millions of us and it's very few of them. But yeah, as I have said, and at the top of this show, the people in power, they are constantly pacifying any and all civil unrest, and they're providing us with bread and circuses, which is pacifying the general public. Every time there's new entertainment or something to come out, or some type of sporting event, that's a way to kind of pacify us, to ignore the atrocities of what's going on in the world. And quite frankly, when the bread and circuses are not enough, they do things like find the Sophie Cunninghams of the world and the Stephen A. Smiths of the world, and they send out members of these marginalized groups to sow dissent amongst others within their marginalized groups, so they could sow dissent and have us continue to battle in these culture wars. And all this stuff that we keep arguing about is not impacting our day-to-day. What is impacting our day-to-day is how high these groceries are. and how fucking difficult it is to find a job, and how impossible it is to, be able to qualify for an apartment somewhere, because you got to make 3 times the rent, and the rent is 8 times as much as it used to be, and the wages have been stagnant for the past 40-50 years. Like, that is truly what is going on in the world, but we as a collective won't come together and fight what the fuck is going on because we're too busy fighting about culture wars. And I guess I'll leave it on this note. There's another saying, poem, whatever, and this one is by Anthony DeMello, and from his book Awareness Conversations with the Masters, where he states, spirituality means waking up. Most people, even though they don't know it, are asleep. They're born asleep, they live asleep, they marry in their sleep, they breed children in their sleep, they die in their sleep without ever waking up. They never understand the loveliness and the beauty of this thing that we call human existence. And I would like to add that people in power are well aware of this, and we continue to be out of alignment with nature, as it is no longer the mother who rocks the cradle to soothe the world, but evil man and patriarchy who is in charge and rocking the cradle to keep the general population asleep. And that is why we must stay woke. Until next time.